In much of the Old Testament, one group of people is singled out above all others as the eternal enemy of the Israelites, the Amalekites. This tribe shows up numerous times in the Pentateuch, Judges, and 1 Samuel, and it is clearly distinguished from other groups in the Levant, such as the Canaanites and Philistines. The relationship between Israel and Amalek in the Bible is fraught with violence. There are ambushes and battles, victories and defeats on both sides. Over the course of biblical history, Amalek grew from an obscure group of hostile nomads into Israel's most hated foe. I would love to tell you what the archaeological evidence says about the Amalekites, who they were, and when and where they lived. The only problem is, well, there is no evidence. Even though many of the other groups mentioned in the Bible appear in contemporary Assyrian and Egyptian inscriptions, the historical record is silent on Amalek. So instead, we must decipher a complex web of interdependent Amalek passages in the Bible to figure out who they were and what their actual relationship to the Israelites was. Some of the earliest references to Amalek in the Hebrew Bible contain surprising clues that could rewrite their entire history. Some biblical traditions involving the Amalekites seem to reflect actual conditions during Judah's monarchic period. Other stories were composed much later for theological or political reasons, and their historical value is less straightforward. Our quest to understand the Amalekites relies on figuring out which is which. For this video, I read through dozens of Bible commentaries, monographs, and journal articles in an attempt to understand how the various Amalek passages relate to each other. Although scholars don't agree on every detail, their findings are quite consistent overall. This presentation, then, is my attempt to synthesize a plausible explanation of how the Amalek tradition evolved from its historical roots to later narratives driven by ideological goals. It's far from a complete picture of the Amalekites, but I think it's a good start. First, a few broad observations. The Bible usually depicts the Amalekites as one of the nomadic tribes inhabiting the harsh, arid region of the Negev desert to the south of the Judahite hill country. The spies of Moses in Numbers 13 report that Amalek lives in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. 1 Samuel describes the Amalekites as ranging from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. Although these locations are not known with certainty, they seem to indicate the desert of northwest Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula. Notably, this very same region is associated with the Ishmaelites in Genesis 25:18. The book of Judges links the Amalekites with the Midianites, and, by implication, the Ishmaelites as well. The Edomite genealogy in Genesis, meanwhile, depicts the Amalekites as an Edomite clan by making Amalek a grandson of Esau. The overall picture implies that the Amalekites were Arab nomads. In a recent book, scholar Christian Fravel summarizes, within the Pentateuchal literary network, Amalek is part of the Proto-Arabian hodgepodge of hostile people living in the southern Negev. Now let's look at some stories. Within the Old Testament, we have encounters with the Amalekites in Exodus and Numbers, a few minor incidents in Judges, and then two significant conflicts in 1 Samuel. From tracing the textual dependence between these passages, it appears that David's campaign in 1 Samuel 30 is one of the earliest. The story is set during the reign of King Saul, while David is serving Philistine King Achish as a mercenary. A few chapters earlier, Achish granted Ziklag, a town on the edge of the Negev, to David, and David has been using it as his base to conduct raids on the Geshurites, Girzites, and Amalekites. Whenever David raids a settlement, he massacres the entire population so that word of his activities won't reach King Achish. Achish, you see, thinks David is raiding Judahite villages. On this occasion, however, David and his warriors are returning home from further north, where Achish's army is fighting Saul. Upon reaching Ziklag, David discovers that the Amalekites have raided the city and captured all its people, including David's 2 wives. David pursues the Amalekites across the countryside, and when he catches up with them, he engages them in battle. David's men utterly defeat the Amalekites, and David is able to recover every captive alive, along with all the livestock stolen by the Amalekites. David returns in triumph to Ziklag, and the episode concludes by listing all the towns to which David gave the Amalekites spoil as gifts. It is immediately after this victory that David learns of Saul's death and is crowned king of Judah. As Van Cedars points out, this presentation of David is not a very praiseworthy one. David's raids against the southern tribes, including Amalek, are essentially mass murder, and David's violence is committed purely out of self-interest, to keep King Achish in the dark about his activities. But when the tables are turned, the Amalekites prove themselves more merciful, killing no one on their raids. It should be noted that this story contains no suggestion that the Amalekites and Israelites are ancestral enemies of each other. No religious command is cited to justify David's raids. David and the Amalekites come into conflict mainly because David's base in Ziklag is close to Amalekite territory. Van Cedars argues that the story in its current form is fiction. However, many scholars agree that some kind of historical reality lies beneath. In a 2010 study, renowned Israeli archaeologist Nadav Naaman attempted to date various elements of the story. In particular, Naaman was able to identify archaeological sites corresponding to most of the towns to which David gave the Amalekite spoil. According to Naaman's interpretation of the archaeological remains, all of those towns prospered during the second half of the 8th century BCE and were destroyed by Sennacherib's campaign in 701. The story also mentions that when David killed all the Amalekites, 400 men escaped on camels. Most scholars see this statement as a later addition to the text, but if the Amalekites did ride on camels, it points to a similar time period. Domesticated camels only came into widespread use in the 9th century BCE with the invention of the cushion saddle, and camel bones do not appear in large numbers at Judahite sites until the 8th century onward. These details then ground the story in the geographical setting of the 8th century, when Judah was rapidly expanding as a kingdom. Proto-Arabian tribes first began appearing in historical inscriptions around that same time, and it's plausible that the Amalekites were one of those early tribes. However, it must also be noted that even if this story reflects the reality of an 8th century author, this is long after the time that the historical David would have reigned. The next piece of the puzzle is a story in Numbers 13 and 14, in which Moses sends out 12 spies to scout out the land of Canaan. The spies return and report that the land is inhabited by Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and Canaanites. Only one spy, Caleb, thinks the Israelites are strong enough to take the land. The Israelites, frustrated that their journey from Egypt has been in vain, complain angrily to Moses and Aaron, and Yahweh declares to Moses that no one who left Egypt will be allowed to enter the Promised Land, except for Caleb. The people then have a change of heart and decide to invade Canaan anyway, despite Moses warning them not to. The Israelites proceed to enter the hill country, but the Amalekites and Canaanites who live there attack and defeat the Israelites, driving them back to a place called Hormah. We find almost exactly the same story in Deuteronomy 1, except that there it is the Amorites instead of the Amalekites who defeat Israel. Proponents of the traditional documentary hypothesis, like Joel Baden, tend to argue that the version in Numbers is more original, while proponents of the supplementary hypothesis, like Van Cedars, see Deuteronomy as earlier. In the latter case, the story would have been expanded and rewritten during or after the exile, replacing the Amorites with the Amalekites during a time when animosity between Judah and Edom had greatly increased. As I mentioned earlier, the genealogy of Esau in Genesis establishes the Amalekites as an Edomite clan. If you've seen my video on Balaam, you may also recall that the story of Israel peacefully passing through Edom in Deuteronomy was rewritten in Numbers to depict the Edomites as hostile to the Israelites and refusing passage. In other words, the later authors of the Pentateuch introduced a hostility between Israel and Edom/Amalek that was not present in earlier passages. In the poetic and prophetic books, Edom is portrayed as Judah's most hated antagonist. Although Edom and Judah had close cultural and economic ties during the monarchic period, they became bitter enemies after the Babylonian conquest. According to historian Juan Manuel Tebes, even as Babylon conquered and deported the Judahites, Edom continued to enjoy independence for several more decades. This caused several biblical authors to view the Edomites either as traitorous collaborators in Judah's destruction or as gleeful onlookers. This resentment toward Edom is evident in other exilic Bible passages, such as Psalm 137. Remember, O Yahweh, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall. how they said, tear it down down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, happy shall they be, who pay you back for what you have done to us, who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. The book of Obadiah is almost entirely devoted to this resentment, blaming Edom for violence toward Judah and feasting on its misfortune. Ezekiel accuses Edom of betraying the Israelites in the day of their distress. Lamentations and Isaiah threaten divine vengeance against Edom as well. This resentment was compounded by a gradual migration of Edomites from the Transjordan into the Negev and southern Judah, occupying the land associated with Amalek in the Bible. When the Jewish elites returned to their homeland, the territory allotted to the province of Yehud was much smaller as a result. The local populace was also regarded by some Judahite priests as a threat to ethnic purity, and the book of Nehemiah portrays the Jews of the Beersheba region and the Arabs of the northern Negev as bitter enemies. It seems likely then that Amalek, whose territory in the Bible matches that of the historical Edomites, are a stand-in for the hated Edomites in the stories of the Pentateuch and 1 Samuel that were written during or after the exile. The next passage to consider is the battle in Exodus 17. In this story, shortly after leaving Egypt, the Israelites come to a place called Rephidim near Mount Horeb and encounter some hostile Amalekites. Moses tells Joshua to raise an army and fight them. While the battle is in progress, Moses stands on a nearby mountain with Aaron and a man named Hur. Moses uses his arms and his staff to influence the battle from a distance. When he raises them, Israel starts winning, and when he lowers them, Amalek starts winning. Numerous commentators describe this behavior as an act of magic. When Moses grows tired, Aaron and Hur assist him by supporting his arms. In the end, Joshua defeats the Amalekites and puts them to the sword. An altar of remembrance is set up, and the final verse proclaims an eternal war between Yahweh and Amalek. Geographically, this battle seems misplaced, since the Amalekites supposedly inhabit the distant Negev and should only be encountered at the end of the wilderness journey. However, if we zoom out a bit, we see that the text has been rearranged so that the journeys before and after Sinai directly parallel each other. Each segment features an incident with quails and manna, a story about water coming out of a rock, a battle with Amalek, and the appointment of judges. The text is arranged in this way for literary reasons rather than any concern for geographical accuracy. According to William Johnston in his Exodus commentary, an author he identifies as the priestly writer reused the narrative in Deuteronomy 1 about Israel's defeat at the hands of the Amorites to craft a news story that depicts Israel more positively. Johnston agrees that the antagonism between Judah and Edom during the exilic period is once again the motivation for the animosity toward Amalek here. Within the narrative itself, no reason at all is given for the Amalekite attack. The sudden appearance of Joshua in this story is also strange. He is not mentioned in the Bible before this moment, and his proper introduction actually occurs much later in Numbers 13, where he is one of the 12 spies chosen to scout out the Promised Land. Only after serving as a spy does Joshua rise to prominence as Moses' assistant and successor. Furthermore, his name is Hoshea until Moses changes it to Joshua in Numbers 13. However, this story assumes that the reader not only knows who Joshua is, but also that he is a great military commander. On that basis, Van Cedars argues that Exodus 17 was composed with knowledge of Joshua's military campaign in the book of Joshua. Furthermore, Moses keeping his staff raised during battle has a close parallel in Joshua 8, where Joshua keeps his arm and sword raised for the entire battle against the city of Ai. The story's secondary nature is suggested by other subtle contradictions. For example, Exodus 13:17 states that God purposely led the Israelites along a route that would avoid the Philistines, thinking that war would cause them to change their minds and return to Egypt. It makes little sense then that he would lead them straight into an Amalekite ambush. We may also wonder how Israel came to be equipped with swords so soon after leaving Egypt. The accomplished German scholar Wolfgang Oswald has an intriguing theory about the original purpose behind Exodus 17. He notes that most scholars are biased toward treating biblical texts as religious texts because of their canonical status in Christianity, but much of the Bible is actually political in its original intent. Oswald argues that this battle story was written in the Persian period as a complex allegory to serve as a political constitution for Judah after the exile. The mountain where Moses stands is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, The altar represents the altar described in Ezra 3 that preceded the Second Temple. Amalek represents Judah's main enemy at the time, Edom. And Moses exemplifies the obligations and behavior of leaders and office holders in the new Judah. Next, we find a curious Amalek reference in Deuteronomy chapter 25, which is part of the Deuteronomic law code. Here, amidst a miscellany of rules about lawsuits, levirate marriage, and weights and measures, there is a command that is unlike any other. It states, "Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and struck down all who lagged behind you. He did not fear God. Therefore, when Yahweh your God has given you rest from all your enemies on every hand, in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." Most commentators think this was a late addition to the text of Deuteronomy, written with direct knowledge of the Exodus 17 battle, especially since it shares some identical wording. However, it introduces new elements to the Amalekite legacy that we haven't seen yet, such as the emphasis on Amalek's immorality. He did not fear God. It also fails to mention Israel's victory, and the claim that Amalek struck the Israelites while they were faint and weary is not supported by the story in Exodus. Deuteronomy itself contains no other mentions of the Amalekites. According to Fabrizio Foresti, these verses were based on an exegetical interpretation of Exodus 17 that assumed the Israelites were weary due to the thirst they had suffered earlier in the same chapter. Foresti also believes this passage was written to foreshadow the final extermination of Amalek by David, the passage we just discussed earlier. After all, David's defeat of the Amalekites is the last time they are mentioned in the Deuteronomistic history, and it is only under David that Israel fully possesses its inheritance. And now we come to one of the latest and bleakest Amalekite stories. In 1 Samuel 15, during the reign of King Saul, the prophet Samuel delivers a command from Yahweh to Saul to destroy all the Amalekites, not only the men, but also the women, children, and infants, as well as all their cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Saul proceeds to kill every last Amalekite, but he spares Amalekite King Agag, as well as the best sheep and cattle, which he intends to sacrifice to Yahweh later. When Samuel hears of this deviation from Yahweh's command, he is irate and declares that Yahweh has rejected Saul as king. Saul repents and admits his error, but Samuel refuses to relent. Agag is then brought before Samuel and executed. Although this story takes place before David's destruction of the Amalekites, there are many reasons to think that Saul's Amalekite war was actually composed and added to the book of 1 Samuel at a later date. I'll discuss a few of those reasons here. First of all, the statement in verse 2 that Yahweh will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt is a direct allusion to the Exodus 17 story, which we've already seen is probably post-exilic, and to the command in Deuteronomy 25 to destroy the Amalekites, which is also late. David's war with Amalek, written much earlier, shows no awareness of this ancestral rivalry with Amalek or the religious command to wipe them out. Secondly, the story introduces a contradiction with the subsequent account of David's raids and war with Amalek. In chapter 30, which we looked at earlier, the Amalekites still inhabit the Negev and are a threat to Philistia and Judah. This would be impossible if Saul had exterminated every last Amalekite, as chapter 15 claims. On this obvious discrepancy, Cynthia Aidenberg remarks, "It is evident that 1 Samuel 30 does not presume an earlier narrative in which the Amalekites are eliminated by Saul and Samuel. The original story of David fighting the Amalekites thus predates the insertion of Saul's holy war." Thirdly, it demonstrates a later interpretation of the herem or holy war doctrine. The original law on herem is found in Deuteronomy chapters 7 and 20. It states that when Israel attacks the nations subject to herem, all the people must be killed, but it seems to allow for livestock and goods to be taken as spoil. This is how herem is depicted in the wars against Heshbon and Bashan. The Israelites kill the inhabitants, but keep the livestock and plunder for themselves. However, later texts like the conquest of Jericho in Joshua 6 demand the destruction of livestock and all plunder, aside from precious metals, as well. 1 Samuel 15 follows this expanded view of herem, and the command in 1 Samuel 15:3 is very similar in wording to the description of herem in Joshua 6:21. Fourthly, the story clashes with the statement in 1 Samuel 14:48 that says Saul had already dealt with the Amalekites. He did valiantly and struck down the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. Fifthly, an entirely different reason for God's rejection of Saul is given earlier in chapter 13. In that story, it is Saul's failure to wait for Samuel before performing a sacrifice that causes Yahweh's rejection. As Van Cedars remarks, it is safe to say that the two stories were not by the same author, because there is no credible reason that an author would recount two different occasions of the deity's rejection of Saul's kingship. Because chapter 15 seems to borrow elements from chapter 13 as well as numerous other Bible passages, Van Cedars concludes that chapter 15 is later. A. Graham Auld, who is probably the leading expert on the books of Samuel and Kings today, agrees that 1 Samuel 15 was written by a later author, and Auld identifies even more biblical sources that the author reused, such as the story in 1 Kings 20 in which King Ahab is condemned by a prophet for sparing the life of King Ben-Hadad after his battle against the Arameans. What is the purpose of this new story about Saul and the Amalekites? We can only speculate, but Foresti, in his book-length study on the rejection of Saul, concludes that because David's success against the Amalekites and obedience to Yahweh led directly to his kingship, a later author decided that Saul must have faced a similar test concerning the Amalekites and failed it. This later author was able to reuse themes from the stories of the Amalekites in the Pentateuch that were unknown to the earlier author, who wrote the story of David and the Amalekites at Ziklag. Since none of the previous Amalekite stories mention any leader of theirs, it's worth asking where 1 Samuel 15 got the character of King Agag from. Back in Numbers 24, the prophet Balaam had declared in an oracle that one day the king of Israel would be higher than Agag. Balaam's oracle does not explain who Agag is, and some textual traditions have the name Gog instead. Within context, it seems to be the name of someone famous from the past. In fact, the name Agag may be related to Ogyges, a legendary king from Greek mythology. But at any rate, Agag is not associated with Amalek in Balaam's oracle. As Foresti sees it, the author of 1 Samuel 15 inferred that Agag had to be the king of a powerful nation. Additionally, Balaam's final oracle describes Amalek as the first among nations. The author of 1 Samuel 15 apparently put these two facts together, concluding that if Agag was a great king and Amalek was the first nation, then Agag must have been king of the Amalekites. Thus, the character of King Agag is plausibly an invention of the author of 1 Samuel 15, based on the earlier text of Numbers. Two references in the book of Judges hint at surprising origins for the Amalekites. Although scholars increasingly see the book of Judges as late overall, the Song of Deborah in chapter 5 is usually thought to be the oldest text in the Bible. In this ancient poem, Deborah calls on the Israelite tribes to join her in battle in the Jezreel Valley. The first Israelites who answer her call are from Ephraim, their root in Amalek. What this means has long puzzled readers and scholars alike. A recent study by Quinn Daniels shows that the word translated root here is used both in biblical and extra-biblical texts to describe a lineage of high-ranking male ancestors and offspring. Daniels concludes that the delegation sent by Ephraim was an Amalekite lineage. This would mean that the Amalekites at an early stage were closely connected with Ephraim, a core Israelite tribe, and they even fought for Deborah on this occasion. Furthermore, Judges 12 says that Abdon ben Hillel, one of Israel's minor judges, was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. If this tradition is authentic, it would confirm the existence of territory shared by Ephraim and Amalek. But how could this be, since the territories of Ephraim and the Amalekites are so distant from each other? One possibility, suggested by Diana Edelman, is that the Amalekites had an enclave in the north. More likely, according to Daniels, is that the Ephraimites had additional territory in the south. Nadav Naaman has argued that the Ephrathites of the Bethlehem area were from Ephraim, and this is quite close to Amalekite territory. The location of Pirathon is unknown, but most proposals situated around the same area in southern Judah. In any case, this possibility is interesting to consider, but does not yet have wide acceptance in scholarship. Although the overall picture presented here is theoretical, I think it is the most plausible interpretation of the various Amalekite passages. To summarize, the oldest passage about the Amalekites involves their defeat at the hands of David and his men, and its geographical details imply a setting in the 8th century during the Judahite monarchy. After the exile, animosity toward Amalek increases, and it seems to function as a stand-in for Edom. Due to the close association of Edom with Esau and Jacob in the Pentateuch, authors may have needed to give the hated Edomites an alternate identity, as Cynthia Aidenberg puts it. As a result, a story of Israel's defeat by the Amorites is rewritten to make Amalek the attacker. As the narrative of Exodus and Numbers is further refined in the post-exilic period, a new story of Moses and Joshua defeating the Amalekites is added, along with an update to the Deuteronomic laws that declare an eternal war against Amalek. Lastly, a new story about Saul conducting harem warfare against the Amalekites and their king is added to 1 Samuel to explain Saul's downfall in contrast to the more successful and obedient David. I've left out a few minor incidents from Judges and Chronicles for the sake of time, but they don't affect this analysis. The legacy of Amalek as the archetypal enemy of the Jews would live on well after the real Amalekites disappeared from history. We see this in the Book of Esther, in which the antagonist Haman is called an Agagite, implying Amalekite ancestry. Mordecai, on the other hand, is descended from a Benjaminite named Kish, just like King Saul. According to John D. Levinson in his masterful commentary, Esther is a completely fictional novella, and the author does not wish his readers to think that Haman and Mordecai are literally descendants of Agag and Saul. Rather, the reader is supposed to contrast the events of Esther with those of Saul. As Levinson puts it, Mordecai rises on the very point on which Saul fell, becoming Prime Minister of Persia and recapturing some of the glory that Saul lost when he spared King Agag.
His instructions were plain enough. He said, I am resolved to blot out these heathen from the face of the land, for I am a jealous God, and I abhor their abominable practices. Put them all to death. Men and women, children, babes in arms, sheep and cattle. Spare nothing from the sword.